Thank you so much. Welcome and happy Earth Day. I am Emanuel Rota, and I am the director of the European Union Center. I'm here with my colleague, Matthias Bördekamp, who is the head of physics, who is a crucial co-organizer of this event. We have been talking about this together, and he has been absolutely crucial in the sort of conceptualization and organization of the event. And so I'm very, very thankful for this. We're also here with our two first speakers for today's symposium, who I'm going to present very, very quickly. I don't want to waste too much time, but I do want to say a few words about what brings us here today. We remember, of course, the major oil spillage that brought havoc to the California coast in 1969. And on this day, 6 years ago, 200 countries signed the Paris Agreement to recognize the need to reduce green gas emissions in the atmosphere. It's the 6th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. It is hard not to see in the middle of what looks like a Malthusian nightmare, pandemic, famine, war, how fossil fuel is still at the center of our political debates. In the 19th century, the introduction of fossil fuel gave Europe and the United States an incredible energy advantage that separated Western economies from traditional economies. The second industrial revolution and imperialism would not make historical sense without the fossil fuel revolution. In the last 50 years, the rise of fossil fuel economies outside of the West, mainly China and India, have reduced the level of inequality between the West and what used to be called the global South, now an area whose borders are increasingly narrow and difficult to define. However, the privilege on which the West supported its own consumption of fossil fuel could not be extended without serious consequences for the planet, without serious consequences for animal life, including human life and its existence. Moreover, fossil fuel, and oil in particular, have left behind a history of colonial relations and a history of despotism, a history of non-democratic regimes that continue to prosper on oil economies and thrive on corruption. Europe today is facing the consequences of its dependency on fossil fuel. Surrounded by oil and gas economies that provide it with energy, Europe pays the price, both in terms of pollution and in terms of the instability that corrupt fossil fuel regimes from Russia to Iran, from Saudi Arabia to Libya, bring to the European borders. Is nuclear energy an alternative? The invasion of Ukraine reminds us of the other major ecological disaster that animated the ecological movement, Chernobyl, and the potential implications of nuclear policy. However, here at the European Union Center, and even more, I guess, in the physics department, we believe in science-driven decision-making and in rational choices. For this reason, we have organized today's symposium to hear from recognized experts who bring us a variety of perspectives on the most current debate on the present and future of nuclear energy. And if you pardon my 1960s joke here, we have assembled a nuclear set of speakers for today's event. Starting with the first panel, our first speaker, Cécile Maisonneuve, who is Senior Fellow for la Ville, Territoire, Développement Durable à l'Institut de Montaigne. She was chairman of La Fabrique de la Cité from 2015 to 2021, a member of the board of directors of the Fondation Le Corbusier. She's also a senior advisor to the Center for Energy of the French Institute for International Relations, which she previously headed. From 2007 to 2012, Cécile has held several positions in the Areva Group, dedicated to international perspectives and public affairs. Cécile Maisonneuve began her career in 1997 in the French National Assembly as a civil servant, working successively for the Defense, the Law, and Foreign Affairs committees. She's a graduate from the École Normale Supérieure, the Paris Institute of Political Studies, and the Sorbonne Paris 4 University in History. She's a fellow historian. She has a long collaboration with various French international think tanks. She's the author of several research papers on energy and of a biography of Benjamin Franklin. The list of titles, academic titles and recognition can go on for quite a while. I'm sure that you have, again, a clear sense of Cécile Maisonneuve as both an intellectual, a researcher, and a public figure who looks at the intersection between public policy and research in France. And our second speaker, Miranda Schreurs, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your last name too badly. You can always, who is chair of energy and environmental policy at the Hochschule für Politiken und München Technical University of Munich. Her main research areas are in international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low carbon energy transitions. She's involved in projects examining the energy transitions in Germany and Japan, climate policies of Europe, the United States, and China, and the politics of high-level radioactive waste disposal. In 2011, she was appointed by Chancellor Angela Merkel as a member of the German Ethics Commission on Safe Energy Supply. From 2008 to 2016, she served as a member of the German Advisory Council of the Environment and is vice chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Council. Miranda Schreurs is also the author of an incredibly long list of academic publications. I was trying to show off my Japanese, but I was told by my wife that it was really not the case. But she does have two major books published in Japan, in Japanese, because she's also an expert of Japanese energy and policies. And among the many publications, I wanted to just put the highlight on a few. Her Orchestrating a Low Carbon Energy Revolution Without Nuclear, Germany's Response to the Fukushima Nuclear Crisis, in Theoretical Inquiries in Law, 2013. Her Transatlantic Environment and Energy Politics, Comparative and International Perspectives, in conjunction with Van den Berg. Her Multi-Level Reinforcement, Explaining EU Leadership in Climate Change Mitigation with Yves Timbergen. And finally, Environmental Politics in Japan, Germany, and the United States, her Cambridge University Press 2002 book, which also won significant accolades and recognition at the international level. Again, as you can see, we start with, I said nuclear, but it's actually stellar set of speakers. The first, again, to speak will be Cécile Maisonneuve. She will give a paper titled Denuclearization versus Decarbonation, How to Solve Europe's Unsustainable Quandary. Then she will speak for 25 minutes. Then I will say the title of Miranda's paper. And then at the end of it, we'll have some time for Q&A. Again, I'm very grateful to the speakers for being here. Welcome, everybody. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emanuel, and good afternoon to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be with you today on the Earth Day and to speak about a low carbon source of energy. So as you said, I would like to answer during this presentation, try and answer, or at least put in the debate this question: should we phase out nuclear power in Europe or reduce carbon intensity? The fact is, for the last 10 years, Europe has been torn between those two options. The first, if I sum it up, being embodied by Germany, and second by France. And when the European Commission presented about 1 month ago its Repower EU plan aiming at reducing EU's reliance on Russian gas in the next coming months and years, nuclear power was not even mentioned. And in my view, this absence of the first source of electricity in Europe, not mentioned in such a context, reveals the extent of the unresolved tension which is underpinning Europe's energy sovereignty. The fact is, with the war in Ukraine, the question of energy sovereignty is back on the top of the agenda. It hadn't been so since 2014, during the beginning of this crisis, because after all, this is the continuity of a crisis. And the point I will defend in this presentation is that I think it's high time the European Union overall its energy policy and make it clear its priority. First, independence from Russian fossil fuels, of course, and reduction of carbon intensity, and to see which is the status of phasing out nuclear power in this context. So the question is, how do we do that? So I will share my screen with a presentation to illustrate what I mean, what I intend to show in the upcoming 25 minutes. So I suppose you all see my screen. So let's start to talk about the context in which we are having this conversation today. We're having this conversation in the context of what I'm describing as a failure of the EU energy policy. I think it's the right moment to think about what we have achieved in terms of energy policy in the EU. We are 25 years after the beginning of liberalization of power and gas market, 15 years after the constitution of the EU, of the Europe of Energy, which is the Lisbon Treaty, the birth act of this policy. And as we all know, a livable and a credible energy policy has three fundamentals. First is energy security in short and long term. Second, an affordable cost. And third, which is the reality of our century, the necessity to achieve net zero in 2050. What can we say about those three goals? Regarding the first two, energy security and affordable cost, I won't spend too much time in explaining that we clearly failed in terms of cost of energy in Europe. This is not only, I would say, a punctual problem where we see electricity price or gas prices skyrocketing in Europe, and it started before the war in Ukraine because of the so-called post-COVID recovery. And regarding the energy security, we all have our eyes on this map, which is a map of the tanker carrying LNG either through the Panama Canal to Asia or to Europe. And each day we see which one are taking one of the other routes or changing their route according to the gas prices. The point is about sustainability. So we could argue that compared to other parts of the world, the situation of Europe in terms of decarbonation is better. But my point is that the current weaknesses and the structural weaknesses of our EU energy policy, meaning the cost issue and the energy security issue, are also radically changing our capacity to reach our targets, starting with the 2030 targets with the Fit for 55 package. So sorry for the quality of this slide. We happen to have this morning to have had at IFRI, at the French Institute for International Relations, a seminar on the consequence on energy geopolitics of the war in Ukraine, and the head of the Center for Climate and Energy, Marc-Antoine Elmazega. I didn't have the electronic version of this, but what he showed and what I would like to underline is in this decade, we have to reach our 2030 goals to invest in Europe something like 200 billion euro per year in clean technologies, meaning electricity grid, energy efficiency, hydrogen, renewable generation, of course, and nuclear. At the same time, what is costing to Europe its failure in terms of energy sovereignty? Exactly 200 billion, more or less, per year in fossil fuels importation. So clearly, the current situation is putting at risk our capacity to reach the third part of this triangle, which is the sustainable energy policy. So in such dramatic context, you could have thought that the questions of the way this energy policy is working, the burden sharing, the competencies, the organization of the market would be on the table. Well, not exactly. And so it's a bit nasty to that, but I can't resist. If you go on the page of energy security in the EU, you will find this, and this is interesting. This is only in French, I didn't find it in English, but it was written in 2020 by the EU Commission. And basically you can read that there is absolutely no risk for energy security in Europe. The situation is under control. Europe can guarantee now and in the future that we will have no energy supply issue. So this was written 2 years ago, and this is still on the website of the EU Commission. You could have thought as well that France, which is holding the presidency of the Union in the first 6 months of this year, would have put this question very high on the agenda, especially because 2 of 3 objectives during this presidency are about, for the first one, sovereignty of Europe, and for the second one, about a new European mode of growth. So 2 topics which have to do, of course, with our energy policy. Well, the word energy is not even mentioned in the different documents of the French presidency. So you could have said, of course, this presidency was prepared before the war in Ukraine, but but as I said earlier, the energy issue, the skyrocketing prices, the threats on the gas storage were already existing before the war in Ukraine. So the question is, we have here a blind spot, and the question is why? Why this blind spot about energy policy, and why don't we have this conversation in Europe about the way we are conducting our energy policy? Well, one of the reasons is that, of course, there is this big divide in Europe about nuclear energy. So this, just to give a view on the current situation of European power generation in Europe. So last year, in 2021, nuclear energy was the first source of electricity production, and the second one was not gas anymore, but coal. Last year, coal generated power increased by 16% in the EU, and before the war in Ukraine burst out, it was scheduled to further increase by 11% in 2022. So we can only think, given the different statements from EU member countries about their necessity or willingness to restart or to change their electricity generation from gas to coal, that it will further and very much more increase in 2022. Strangely enough, when you look at the Repower EU plan announced by the European Commission last month, which was about reducing, as I said earlier, Russian gas consumption in our energy mix, there was absolutely no mention of a role of nuclear energy. So we agree on this. In the short term, nuclear energy can play a very partial role, but it has a role to play. And especially a few days before the EU Commission launched this Repower EU plan, the International Energy Agency published its 10 points plan on the same topic. And it mentioned what we could do in terms of nuclear energy contribution to reduce our dependency, our immediate dependency to Russian gas. So it mentioned the necessity to postpone some maintenance, safety checks in the French nuclear power plants because we have an issue with only half of the nuclear fleet in France currently functioning. I will come back on this. And it also mentioned the necessity for countries which were intending to shut down some NPPs during this year, especially Germany and Belgium. So the recommendation of the IEA expert was to postpone this shutdown. So as I said, there is absolutely no mention of this in the communication of the European Commission. So it clearly shows that this choice to cancel nuclear energy from the public debate is a choice to cancel the debate, the democratic debate we have to have on the role of nuclear energy in particular, but on our energy policy in general. So we have to have this conversation because this political conversation, because as far as I would say, science has spoken or public opinion has spoken, situation is rather clear. If we look at the the climate experts from the IPCC said about the role of nuclear energy. So there are many very interesting information in the reports issued at the beginning of this month. So in different scenarios, they're explaining the role of nuclear energy. So it increases more or less according to different scenarios. But if you look at the current situation of Europe, one of the reasons why many European countries are considered very well advanced in their energy transition which is more for most of them, except Sweden perhaps, the electricity transition. You can see that they all heavily rely on nuclear energy. So there are the lines which you have at the very bottom of this chart. So we know that this is the opinion of science, but let's go to what public opinions think. And recently, the British organization YouGov published a very, very interesting survey on the perception of nuclear energy in European countries. So there were many information, and I could have, well, I hesitated to put in this presentation one which is not very encouraging, showing that in many countries, a huge part of public opinion think that nuclear energy emits CO2, including in France, where you could have thought that with such a share of nuclear energy in our electricity mix, people knew what it was about, but there are nearly half of the people asked about if nuclear energy emits CO2 that say yes. So this shows that there is still a lot of work to do. But those two questions are interesting too, showing that even in countries where the role and the share and the history with nuclear energy is very different, you don't have so many differences, and including in Germany. This was a surprise for me, I must say, when I compare in the second chart, is nuclear power necessary to combat climate change? There is nearly no difference between the two countries, in spite of their huge differences as far as energy policy is concerned. So, question from this, I would say, situation: where where do we go? So, if you look at the map of who has and who has not, who is not using nuclear energy in Europe, so this is a static map. It doesn't say a lot. In fact, we have 5 different groups of countries in Europe as far as nuclear energy is concerned. The first group is a group of countries which clearly said and are implementing a shutdown of their reactors. The first of them being, of course, Germany. Until recently, I would have said I would have been so clear with Belgium, but Belgium decided to postpone part of the shutdown of its nuclear, and is strongly recommend, and the International Energy Agency is strongly recommending to this country to stop this policy, because it will mean relying only on gas. Spain is another country which decided to phase out nuclear. You have a second group of countries which I would say at the opposite is building new reactors. This includes France. This includes Finland with the recent connection of its reactor, and Slovakia. You have a third group of countries intending to build more. So of course you find in this group France. You find many countries in Eastern and Central Europe. You have a group of countries which is not very clear about the status of its policy. Sweden is in this category with huge internal debates because of the increase of electricity prices and the necessity to import fossil fuel electricity because of the recent shutdown of nuclear power plants in the south of the country. And you have a fifth group of countries, I would say the future newcomers. Poland is the main one, and has forecast a huge program. Recently, Greece started talking with Bulgaria as far as Bulgaria's SMS project are concerned, and very reverse of position. Estonia expressed its interest, and it's even in Estonia, which was signed a Tallinn declaration about the use of SMR. So the question is, so we clearly see that there is different status, and I would say there is a main political divide, which is between countries which want to go on or with new nucleus or to expand the life of their plants, and a group of countries adamantly opposing any new projects in as far as nuclear energy is concerned, and even trying to have the existing one closing as soon as possible. So this is for Germany, Luxembourg, Austria, and Portugal is one of them as well. So I don't think this divide is livable, especially as in this division you see many countries from Eastern and Central Europe who will still, with the situation in Ukraine, we will still less accept this, I would say, this division in Europe. So we need to preserve the unity of Europe. So what could we do? So recently for Institut Montaigne, I wrote with Benjamin Frémaux a paper, and we propose a 3-pillar strategy. First pillar would be a kind of political agreement, a political neutrality agreement. So treaties are the treaties. So should we reopen the treaty as far as EU energy policy is concerned? I think so, but this is not the right moment. For the moment, we have to fight against our dependency to Russian gas. But in the meantime, I think the vision we offer, especially to Vladimir Putin, of a divided Europe and of squabbling Europe about energy is weakening our position. So we need to go from this agreement to disagree to another status, which is political neutrality agreement, which implies that countries deciding to phase out do not interfere with countries which decide to further move on nuclear energy. And from that point of view, I must say I was shocked by the declaration of the German Minister of Environment, which on the eve of the Russian aggression to Ukraine was in Poland and said to Polish authorities that she would do anything which is possible from the legal point of view in Brussels to stop Poland nuclear project. So this is, for me, in the new context, this can't work anymore. Second pillar, the financial framework. So we have this huge debate about the taxonomy. I think the current taxonomy promotes a very conservative view of nuclear energy, which is not compatible to the new context. From that point of view, I think the taxonomy is already dead. And actually, it's another topic, but from the taxonomy and what it said about defense is also totally unfit to the new geopolitical context. So for me, taxonomy is really the reflect of the ancient world, which is dead on February the 24th with the attack of Russia and Ukraine. But more than that, we need to clarify the financial framework for financing new NPPs. There are different models which have been discussed, are implemented. The Finnish models with industrial building their own reactors to be sure to have fixed, clear, visible energy prices. You have the UK model, which is still improved. You have the Czech model. And the question is also, by the way, to oppose a European model to the Rosatom model, which is extremely efficient. They sell the plants, they give the money, and they can even operate for newcomers. So we have to oppose this model, not only in Europe, by the way, but also in third countries outside of Europe. Third pillar, we have, of course, an industrial issue. The fact is that we don't have any nuclear vendor anymore in Europe with the disappearance of Areva. The only European vendor today is Rosatom. EDF is not a vendor. EDF has huge problems. They have to solve their own problem in France. They have to discuss with their favorite shareholders, the French state, which is a shareholder. We could discuss the wisdom, but this is not the topic for this conference. But as you can see, when you see the status of nuclear French power plants, there is much to be said about the governance and the industrial issue in this country. So the industrial basis is to rebuild. So it started already in some countries, started in the UK, in the US, as well, with new models. It's more private sector led. It's also, there are also startups. There is this SMR movement, and this is the coalition which was formed in Tallinn last year. So clearly we have to build, to refound the industrial nuclear in Europe, and possibly with other partners outside of Europe. So in my conclusion, I would like to say that in my view, nuclear energy may be only a part and not the main part of our energy future. But the problem, the debate, or the non-debate, the non-democratic debate we have or we don't have about nuclear energy is undermining your EU efforts to build a credible and viable energy policy for the future. We shouldn't forget that energy policy is at the is fundamental, is the basis of Europe. It is what built Europe with the European Community of Steel, Coal and Steel in 1950. 2 of the 3 founding treaties of Europe are talking about energy. And I can't help noticing some, I would say, a risk of fragmentation. Recently, if you hear carefully what Mario Draghi says, so as a former central banker, he has this ability, this wonderful ability to say very much without saying a lot. But the few things he said about energy clearly, in my view, shows that we should really put this topic on the table, and we should get rid of the idea that any country will have a special relation with Russia, and prepare for the next step, which is the new this energy and ecological transition. We lived in the fossil fuel intense world. We are shifting to materials, raw material intensive world. We are not prepared in Europe for this. This is what we have to work on, and we won't replace a special relation with Russia, so-called special, with another so-called special relation with China. So we have to prepare this next step, and to prepare this, we have to solve this division on nuclear energy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. This has been great. Again, I don't want to waste your time. Again, with consideration of the fact that air conditioning wasn't that common until 15 years ago in many places in Europe. Now, apparently, it's essential to European life, but sorry. Now we have, again, our second speaker. I already introduced Miranda Schreurs, but let me repeat the title of her paper, which I think already is in communication with the previous one. The title is The Ukraine War and the EU Sustainability Taxonomy. The taxonomy has been mentioned a few minutes ago, so we're looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will also thank you to Cécile. It's really nice hearing your perspective on these issues. And I will simply say, you're likely to hear a slightly different perspective on the question from me. And I should give you a little bit of background. I grew up in New York, very close to 3 Mile Island. And then I lived in Japan, very close to where you had the Tokaimura uranium reprocessing plant accident and near the Fukushima nuclear accident. And I live in Germany, which was also impacted by the Chernobyl nuclear accident. So that is a little bit in my background. And I've also lived in Japan, Europe, and the United States. So I bring into this perhaps a few different perspectives. I'm also going to share my screen, and some of what we've just heard may also be visible here, but I think most of what I have to say goes in a somewhat different direction. My first comment will be on the Ukraine war, because the Ukraine war is certainly impacting all of us intensely. In fact, I'm giving this talk from my bedroom right now, in part because I have a Ukrainian family living with me here, and we are using all the rooms that I have in my house right now. So the Ukraine war has impacted Europe in a real way. What we were just hearing about in terms of electricity generation is certainly something that we need to be thinking about. So electricity generation in Europe has been very much impacted by what is going on, both in terms of climate change, in terms of positions on nuclear energy, and now with the Ukraine war, we'll expect another big impact. One thing that I would like to point out on this graph is that, yes, Europe remains heavily dependent on fossil fuels in its electricity mix. You see the black at the bottom, the coal and oil and the gas. And nuclear is about 25% of the mix right now. So combined, the 3 energy sources are a very big part of the mix. But you'll also notice the relatively rapid growth here of renewable energy. And I think this is something that needs to be brought into the discussion. When renewable energy was started in the European context, you can see here from the graph that around 2000, there was still relatively little renewables at all in the mix. And the price was pretty heavy, pretty extensive, pretty high. So back in 2000, it was very expensive to do renewables. But the reality is that with the developments, not only in Europe, but also in China, which now outpaces Europe in a big way in the development of renewable energy, the price has come down so cheaply that it's hard to justify building any other kind of electricity facility, because the renewables is really just that much cheaper. I somehow clicked on something here. I have the right thing open. Hang on just a sec. Sorry, I have a couple things going on here. Let's close that. Let's go back to this. I clicked on the graph and that made that happen. If we look at the share of electricity production from nuclear, we see some pretty big differences in Europe. And of course, we just heard the French perspective, and France is in a situation where nuclear dominates the electricity mix. And you could actually question if that isn't a security threat for France, because what we saw in Japan with the Fukushima nuclear accident, the necessity not only to shut the Fukushima nuclear power plants down after the tsunami and the earthquake, but actually the entire fleet of nuclear power plants in order to meet new security standards, safety standards. And I know in Japan, one of the big questions relative to France was if France were to have an accident, what would that mean? In fact, you could say that France is in a situation of overdependence on a particular electricity source. What we also see is a downward trend in electricity coming from nuclear in the big users here. Japan is dramatically down, although they are turning a few of the nuclear power plants back up. The German percentage here, which you see in the brown line, is actually over-representing because they haven't yet taken into account the shutdown of the 3 nuclear power plants in 2021. So the share of electricity from nuclear in Germany today is 6%. Okay. And where do we have nuclear power plants? We heard that a little bit. Here you see some numbers. So France dominates nuclear power. Germany used to be a second big challenger, but it is down to 3 operating nuclear power plants. And what we also see is a few other countries that have been mentioned, such as Belgium or Switzerland or Sweden, which have long-term plans over the next decade or two to shut down their remaining nuclear power plants. Although certainly with what's going on in the Ukraine, there may be some questioning of how quickly that happens. The other reality is, although we heard about a few nuclear power plants being built, there are very few nuclear power plants being built in Europe right now. So here in brackets, you see those countries which are constructing reactors. But the reality is there are more on the way for shutdown than there are that are currently being constructed. And I think what we also see here is that there's a sizable group of countries without nuclear power, and there are likely to be more in a short period of time. So the Russian war in the Ukraine is clearly going to have big energy implications. It's going to have big implications for climate politics and also for resource politics. I find it tragic from a human perspective. What's going on in the Ukraine is just, it's beyond belief. From a geopolitical perspective, it's also really hard to understand that we're going back into a deep Cold War. And unfortunately, I fear that this Cold War could be around for a long time. And I also fear that a new dimension to it might be deep tensions with China. I hope that that can be overcome. But I agree very much with what Cécile said, that we have here a case of a changing politics of energy and resources. And that is something that will be important for Europe to think about. Something that surprises me very much in this debate about nuclear power is that we haven't heard more about the safety issues associated with nuclear power plants, as well as with the spent fuel that is in temporary storage in most countries in the world. The assumption is always that nuclear power will be built in countries where we have political stability. And what we've seen in the Ukraine should make us all question some of those assumptions. We have seen the Chernobyl nuclear site invaded by Russian forces. We have seen a lack of understanding of what a radioactive waste site means and the dangers that could be associated with it. We have seen a missile attack on a nuclear facility. Fortunately, the missile did not land on the reactor core itself, just on an office building. This really, for the debate, should be and needs to be something that is brought into discussion. Are we really are we taking risks that are not fair either to this or next generations? And of course, in the past, we've had terrorist activities. So I'm not sure that what we thought was safe before we can really consider safe today. Now, the European Union is very dependent on Russia. So the European Union is getting about 60% of its fossil fuels from outside, and a very large chunk of that is coming from Russia. So you see the figures, it's a bit small here, but Russia is supplying 27% of crude oil in the EU. It's something on the order of 40% of the natural gas in the EU, and about almost half of the hard fuel, so the coal that's coming into Europe. France is less impacted by this than is Germany. Germany is extremely dependent on Russian gas, oil, and coal. And we notice that right now because Germany is under quite a lot of international pressure and criticism for not turning off the gas pipeline, and it's of course been criticized very heavily for even having thought that it was a good idea to build Nord Stream 2 and further that dependence on Russian oil and gas. So this is very much an issue. But I think the question is really how we react to it. Now, the Belgium case we also heard about just now. I think it's an interesting case in that Belgium is very dependent still on nuclear and its electricity mix, and it hasn't yet done enough to diversify its electricity mix to move in the direction of more renewables. Interestingly, with the decision in Belgium to extend the operating time of 2 of the reactors that were targeted for a shutdown, Belgium had planned to go denuclear by 2025. They are to be extended for 10 years. And at the same time, a big investment is supposed to be going into renewables. And this includes offshore wind, hydrogen, which I think is something that will be very important in the energy mix down the road, solar energy, and then also the electrification of mobility. So this is one reaction in Belgium. Another is that they are showing an interest in small modular nuclear reactors. And here I think too, we need to bring in the question that I haven't heard very much about, which are the security dimensions surrounding the idea of building more small modular nuclear reactors. I don't think we've figured that part of the equation out at all. Germany has 3 remaining nuclear power plants. The Minister President of Bavaria, where I live, Markus Söder, has proposed the idea of extending the lifetime of these 3 nuclear power plants because of the Ukraine crisis. His proposal has to date not received much support. And I think there's numerous reasons behind it. One is what I just mentioned about what has happened in Russia. How can we be saying we should be doing more with nuclear, knowing what has gone on with nuclear facilities that have been attacked in Chernobyl or the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant? There are also legal hurdles to an extension, although some people say they could be overcome. But an area that concerns me very much, it's part of where I spend a lot of time, is the unanswered question of what do we do with all that radioactive waste that we have been generating for decades and where we still have very few answers to. Yes, Finland is getting closer to opening its high-level radioactive waste facility. Germany is decades from having a nuclear waste repository. And that means that The high-level radioactive waste is in storage, which one could also question in cases of political stability. Is that really such a safe way to be maintaining waste? Yes, so why is this related to the nuclear waste question? Well, it's also because getting a consensus in Germany to build a nuclear waste repository was dependent on an agreement to phase out nuclear. Thus, if we were to change that, it could lead to a lot of questions about what is really the potential here for dealing with the nuclear waste. And if we don't, we are leaving next generations with a pretty big challenge, a financially extremely expensive challenge, and a lot of instability that could come with it, a lot of conflict, societal conflict. The other thing we just heard about from Cécile, which is great, is that the reaction to the Ukraine war is very likely to be just what we need. And I hate to say that in relationship to a war, but it will force us to do what we should have been doing a long time ago. And that is really questioning our energy systems. So yes, Europe has been investing quite a lot in renewables in the past, and it's started to make some substantial progress here. I think now with the Ukraine war, we are going to see a massive scaling up of renewables. And you might question, well, is that really so doable? Don't forget that in China last year, China invested and built the same amount of renewables as the rest of the world combined. And India has a plan for 500 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. So we are in big competition with other parts of the world in these areas. So I think what we're going to see is a lot of removal of bureaucratic hurdles on renewables. There's going to be a big push to integrate Europe, which moves a little bit in the direction of what Cécile was talking about in terms of having a stronger European approach to energy. And you're going to see new targets. So Germany's target, for example, is to switch from a 80% target for renewables in its electricity mix to a 100% renewable energy target, and that by no later than 2035. And so in many countries, we're going to be seeing a bigger push on offshore wind as well as on onshore wind, and combining this with a push on green hydrogen and battery storage. So the growth I've already mentioned, so I won't spend any time here, just to say we've seen some big growth. And just a little bit more on that background of why the opposition in Germany to nuclear. I think you have to remember that Germany was a country that was divided. It was the location of the Cold War within Europe for a long time. And there's a clear connection in the German mind between conventional nuclear power and military nuclear power. So here you see many people gathering to protest the development of nuclear power plants in their backyard. This is in the 1970s, when all political parties were still supportive of nuclear power. That began to change in the early 1980s when the Greens entered the German Bundestag in 1983. They were a small party. They just made it past the 5% hurdle, but they were able to start bringing in new issues into the debates in Parliament. And they were also strengthened in their perspective because 3 years after they came into the Parliament saying, we're against nuclear, the Chernobyl nuclear accident happened. After which time the Social Democratic Party also turned against nuclear. And for Germany, the impact was felt in part because there was more radioactive fallout in the German territory by far than in France. So even today, there are many regions in Germany where people are told not to eat mushrooms or not to eat wild boar because of radiation concerns. And again, the question of what do you do with the high-level radioactive waste? And really decades worth of conflict around this issue, in part because of concerns that if you have a high-level radioactive waste facility, then you are basically giving industry the okay to keep producing nuclear. I mentioned that Germany was a divided country. It's maybe also important to see where is it that both countries, both the West and the East, started to build their radioactive facilities for low and medium waste, and in the East German case for high-level radioactive waste. And it's all along the border here between what was West and what was East. And interestingly now, Switzerland is building or looking at building its nuclear waste facility right on the Swiss-German border. There's some interesting geopolitics that come into the question. And actually Europe has never thought about, well, should we actually have a European-wide nuclear waste facility? It will not happen because nobody wants to take somebody else's high-level radioactive waste. You see a lot of protest here. The scale of protest in Germany when it comes to nuclear is dramatic. And we also have a history of a previous attempt in 2010. The party that was not yet convinced on going nuclear or for nuclear phase out was the Christian Democratic Union and its sister party here in Bavaria, the Christian Socialist Union. So when they were in power in 2010, it was quite some time since the Chernobyl nuclear accident, and they thought, well, maybe the public is okay with an extension, and they tried it. So they pushed through an extension in 2010, saying, let's let the nuclear power plants run for another 8 to 12 years on average. Bad timing, because 6 months later you had the Fukushima nuclear accident, and the trust was rather broken. And this was clearly then a reason for breaking off with this nuclear question. So after that, that was when I was asked to join an ethics committee in Germany to think about what's the future of the German energy system. And this commission was interestingly called an ethics commission, because we were asked to think about how do we develop a system that is ethical to this and future generations. And our committee basically argued for a phase down of nuclear rather than an immediate shutdown, which was being called for by some, but basically to let the existing nuclear power plants run out their licenses while we build up renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that has led partly to the decisions for the nuclear power plant shutdowns. So there were 17 in 2011. There are now 3 left. And you can see here, there's one in the south of Germany in Isar, a second in Neckar-Westheim, also in the south. And the third is the Emsland nuclear power plant in the west. So we're getting close, and we will soon see that in Germany, all of these decisions are taking us to the next phase of the nuclear story, and that's dealing with the back end. I'm going to ask real quickly here, how are we doing on time? Are we okay for another 5 minutes?
3 minutes would be better, but
okay, I'll even make it 2. So I'll just say the Commission on High-Level Radioactive Waste has been set up, and we now have another committee, which is a citizens-based committee that's really trying to help bring public attention to this question and public involvement in thinking about how do we find the safest location for a nuclear waste site. And yeah, that's a picture of the Isar nuclear facility. And here you can see the locations in Germany that are still being considered for a nuclear waste site, and the conferences that are being held to discuss with the public about this. So bringing in young people to discuss it. And now we're at a stage where there are 90 locations that are going through a deeper level of assessment to also help us think about what the methodologies are for trying to find the most suitable location. And finally, to the EU taxonomy. We see a slightly different map here than the one that Cécile showed us. And what we see here are the countries in blue that were opposed or were neutral in that they didn't say anything about the taxonomy, including nuclear power. And the green ones that were very actively for nuclear power. And I want to point out something here, which I think we should be thinking about. One is that most of the countries here that are green and that were pushing for nuclear are also members of the former Soviet Union and developed their nuclear power plants during their time in the Soviet Union. France is a nuclear weapon state. Britain is a nuclear weapon state. Same with Canada, the United States, China, Russia, India, Pakistan. Most of the countries that are pursuing a continuation of conventional nuclear are also nuclear weapon states or non-democracies. So I think there's some interesting questions there that need to be brought up. And here I just mentioned that we're starting to see stronger protests against the taxonomy. This is the Fridays for Future group opposing the taxonomy's inclusion of both gas and nuclear into the mix. I agree with Cécile that I think that the taxonomy is probably dead because of the Ukraine crisis. Very, very last things I want to mention is that there are also opposing voices. So we have several lawsuits that are now in consideration against the taxonomy. Luxembourg and Austria have announced that they will fight this before the European Court of Justice, and Germany was considering joining that fight. Although with the Ukraine crisis, it may all no longer be necessary, because I think there will be really big problems with the taxonomy now. All right, I'll stop, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cécile. Thank you so much, Miranda. I think I speak on behalf of everybody in giving you a big applause, virtual as it is, but still very, very meant. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. We don't have a lot of time. Mostly it's my fault and your exceedingly long academic titles. You guys work too much. But jokes aside, we do have one question from Niga Akerwal in chat that I think could be addressed to both of you, which is very pertinent to both your papers. The question of renewable is undoubtedly underway, but it will take some time. In the meantime, is it imaginable that Europe starts buying natural gas from the US rather than Russia to face the current crisis and sort of put temporary stops to the situation?
Cécile, would you like to go first?
As you wish, Miranda. Yeah, quick question, quick answer. Sorry. So thank you for the question, and thank you, Miranda, for your presentation. It was extremely interesting, and we could speak for hours, but we don't have time. Just to answer the question about replacing Russian gas. So there is a short-term issue and the long-term issue. Let's talk short-term. The best solution would be first to not to need it and to reduce our consumption. But this is not for the moment on the table. There is a division within Europe on this option, cutting Russian gas abruptly. And the main problem would be first for very industrialized country heavily depending on Russia, and Germany is of course first online. The second problem would be a social issue, because there are many European households who depend on gas for their heating. So we are spring, we are reaching the month of May, so we will need it less, but we need also gas for the moment to replenish the storage for next winter. For gas companies, replenishing starts now. So if we don't do it now, we'll have problem for next winter. The problem is next winter. Nobody knows in Europe how we will go through next winter. So yes, there are many contracts with LNG, US LNG producers, but the problem we have, first problem, there are some companies some countries who don't want to send long-term signals to US LNG producers, and US LNG producers need long-term signals to invest. So we have a problem. Problem is that I'm afraid to say that in Europe, there are some people, some companies, some countries who think that when everything is finished, the war in Ukraine is finished, they will restart their relation with Russia. And this is terrible to say, but there are many people thinking like this. So we have this issue. Second point, there is an issue about the lack of LNG supply. If Europe buys at very expensive price US LNG, it will mean more coal. It's already the case in Asia. So we have this terrible conundrum for the moment with this gas prices. Where does it go? And lack of supply. So in the middle term, we don't have enough LNG to supply all the demand. So we have a huge problem. But at the same time, you're right. If we take out Russian gas, by what do we replace it? So it can be LNG. For the moment, it will be coal, mostly coal. So the point is not about renewable nuclear, it's a fossil fuel issue, because even if we build many renewable, we shouldn't forget that they are intermittent, and we saw it last winter. We wouldn't have that winter, even in countries with a huge share of renewable energy. They need some fossil fuel, and if it's not here, it's not here. So we have a problem. We have shut down so many pillow table power plants, meaning fossil fuels or nuclear, that we have an electricity supply issue in the coming years. And we had some free riders behaviors between countries saying, oh, I can shut down, I will import from the others, but many countries say that. And here we are. So we have this, I mentioned it, but this the EU, the energy mix is a competency of state. The security of supply is a competency of EU Commission. So this doesn't match. We have to reflect on this.
Thank you so much. We do have, we want to start the next panel at 15. So we do have just very little time. Also, it's very late for you in Europe. You have been incredibly generous with us. So then it's your time, Miranda, to answer the question. We can also add Matthias' question, which is, and what happens in the very, very immediate future if an act of war shuts down the gas pipeline for Europe? I mean, renewables are going to take a long time. And what are we doing right now to imagine something in the immediate future?
Yeah, so in fact, that's already happening. So one thing that is positive, there are numerous pipelines, and there are also numerous pipelines across Europe, and they are currently already shifting gas from west to east. So gas can flow in both directions. What we have seen in the last months is one of the most dramatic transitions in energy use in a long time. So coal phase out with Russia is already happening. There are discussions, which I think will take place right after the French elections, to embargo oil from Russia. And Germany is talking about being able to possibly stop its gas imports from Russia by the end of this year. which is a big change from already a month ago and how Germany was talking about this. And it's a lot to do with finding new sources. The Middle East, more from Norway, a little bit more from the Netherlands, coal from Australia, and rapid build out of renewables. The other thing we haven't talked about yet, and that's something I learned in Japan, you can do a lot with energy efficiency. And something that's really, it's bothering me that we're not doing more with it yet. I don't understand why we haven't yet, like happened in Japan after the Fukushima accident, basically really looked around to see where can we do a lot more with energy efficiency saving. And so that's not a whole answer by any means. It's an extremely complicated question. I don't want to say that Europe could cut off of all nuclear right away, and I don't think it's going to happen either. But I think we have a big change going on here, and it'll be a change that's also going to go on in the United States. I think we're going to see a big transition there too.
Hopefully, in terms of efficiency, the United States has certainly a lot to do. Thank you so much.